The Story of Ice. Episode 1 Humble Beginnings. Jade Ice Daniels was born into a legacy. Her father, Jeremiah King Daniels, was more than just a kingpin, he was the king. A man with a presence so magnetic that even the air seemed to hold its breath when he entered a room. In the South, especially in their corner of Atlanta, his name was both feared and revered. And for Ice, his youngest and most precocious daughter, that legacy was a crown too heavy to ignore. The Daniels family was the epitome of Afrocentric excellence. Their sprawling estate sat on the edge of the city, a fortress that blended modern opulence with cultural roots. The front gate bore an intricate mural of Sankofa birds, and the walls inside the mansion were adorned with African masks, bold kente cloth patterns, and black and white photos of their ancestors. Jeremiah made sure that his children knew where they came from. History wasn't just in the books, it was in their blood. Ice's mother, Imani, was the calm to her father's storm. A poet and scholar with a PhD in African Studies, she balanced the edge of Jeremiah's world with an unshakable grace. Her presence was like a soft breeze in the heat of summer, a reminder that power didn't always have to roar to be felt. Together, they were a power couple that demanded attention, a perfect harmony of fire and water. Jade inherited her father's sharp mind and her mother's discerning heart. From a young age, she had a knack for seeing things others couldn't. At 10, she could spot a counterfeit bill at a glance. By 15, she was solving problems for her dad's operation without even trying. But she wasn't officially involved, not yet. Jeremiah was adamant about that. "You're my princess, Ice," he'd say, his voice heavy with love and authority. "I'll build empires for you, but I'll be damned if I let this world swallow you whole." But Jade was her father's daughter, and the streets whispered her name long before she stepped onto the chessboard. She had a presence cool, calculated, and commanding. Where her older brother, Caleb, was all bravado and swagger, Jade was quiet power. People underestimated her, mistaking her silence for submission. That was their first mistake. Growing up, she observed everything. The way her father's men deferred to him, their voices low and respectful. The way her mother could disarm even the most hardened gangster with a single word. The way the neighborhood kids straightened up when they saw the Daniels family car roll by. Respect wasn't just given, it was earned, demanded, and, when necessary, taken. Jade's world wasn't just black and white. It was a kaleidoscope of shades. School was one color. She attended an Afrocentric private academy where lessons about algebra were intertwined with lessons about the Mali Empire and the Harlem Renaissance. Home was another color, a place of warmth, culture, and strategy. The streets, though, were a shade she hadn't yet learned to navigate on her own. But that would change soon enough. By the time Jade turned 18, the whispers became louder. Jeremiah's health was declining. Diabetes had taken a toll on the man who once seemed invincible. Caleb, the eldest son, was poised to take over, but everyone, including Caleb, knew he didn't have the vision or discipline their father did. The empire needed Jade, whether Jeremiah wanted it or not. It started small. Jade began accompanying Caleb to meetings, sitting silently in the corner while the men talked business. She'd listen, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. One night, when Caleb botched a negotiation with a supplier, Jade stepped in. "With all due respect," she said, her voice steady and cold as winter air, "you're not in a position to renegotiate terms. We've tripled your revenue in the past year. You need us more than we need you." The room went silent. The supplier, a middle-aged man with a scar running down his cheek, stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "She's right," he said gruffly. "Deal stands." From that night on, Jade wasn't just a spectator. Her father's men started coming to her with problems they didn't trust Caleb to solve. She didn't seek power, but it gravitated toward her like iron to a magnet. Her reputation grew not as a tyrant, but as a strategist. Jade didn't need to yell to command respect. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. But power came with a price. The streets were watching, and not everyone was pleased with the rise of Jeremiah's daughter. Rivals saw her as a threat, an easy target compared to her father's iron grip. And while Jade had inherited the family's cunning, she was still learning the rules of the game. One night, as she walked to her car after a meeting, a man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but his intentions were clear. "You're an over-your-head little girl," he sneered. "This ain't your daddy's world no more." Jade didn't flinch. Her hand grazed the knife tucked into her waistband, a gift from her father with the words "Stay Sharp" engraved on the blade. She met the man's gaze, her eyes colder than steel. "You think I'm scared?" she said, her voice low and deadly. "You think I'm not ready? Try me." The man hesitated, then backed away, muttering under his breath. Jade didn't relax until he disappeared into the night. She knew this was just the beginning. To survive, she'd have to be sharper, colder, and smarter than everyone else. The streets had underestimated Jade Ice Daniels. They wouldn't make that mistake again. To be continued. Episode 2: Bloodlines and Blueprints. Jade Ice Daniels always knew that power came with a price. Her father, Jeremiah King Daniels, didn't build an empire by playing nice, and the hood knew what it was for real. But with his health waning and Caleb's half-hearted attempts at leadership, it was becoming clear that Ice would have to shoulder the weight of their bloodline. She wasn't just Jeremiah's daughter, she was his heir. And whether the streets were ready for her or not, Ice was ready for them. The day started like any other. Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Daniels estate, casting golden streaks across the Sankofa mural at the gate. Inside, the quiet hum of the household was a stark contrast to the chaos that awaited Ice beyond those walls. She stood at the kitchen island, sipping black coffee, her sharp eyes studying the notes in front of her. Numbers, names, roots. The family operation had grown under Jeremiah's rule, but expansion brought problems that Caleb, despite his bravado, couldn't fix. Missing shipments, letting folks slid on collections, rival crews sniffing around their business like vultures circling carrion. Caleb didn't see it, but Ice did. "You need to get off my D," Caleb snapped, walking into the room. He wore a leather jacket with gold chains glinting at his neck, his drip masking the doubt Ice knew simmered beneath. "I'm not on your D main," Ice replied, her voice calm, cold. "I'm overseeing." Caleb scoffed, slamming a folder onto the counter. "It's handled." Handled doesn't mean sloppily patched up. "These people are watching us. The moment we lack, they'll take their shot," she said, flipping the folder open. The sight confirmed what she suspected. Poorly tracked shipments, missing money, a paper trail messier than it should be. Caleb's arrogance would burn them all. "You think you can do better?" Caleb challenged, stepping closer. Ice didn't blink. She looked him in the eye, unshaken. "Yeah, I do." Before Caleb could respond, Jeremiah entered the room, his steps slower than they used to be, but his presence no less commanding. He glanced between his children, taking in the tension. "What's this?" Jeremiah asked, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Caleb spoke first, as he always did. "Nothing, just business." Jeremiah's sharp gaze flicked to Ice. "And what does your sister say?" Ice slid the folder toward him. "The numbers don't add up, Daddy. If we don't tighten up, the streets will notice, and they'll come for us." Jeremiah studied the folder, his brow furrowing slightly. For the first time in months, Ice saw a flicker of pride in his eyes. He looked at her, then at Caleb. "Your sister's right," Jeremiah said quietly. "Get your house in order." Caleb tensed, but he didn't argue. He stormed out, leaving Ice alone with her father. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Ice watched as Jeremiah lowered himself into a chair, his breathing a little labored. "You were listening," Ice said, pouring him a cup of tea. "Of course I was. I listened to everything," Jeremiah replied. He took the cup from her, his hand still strong despite the tremor that occasionally showed itself. "You're watching out for this family. Someone has to," Ice said softly. Jeremiah studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing, calculating. "You remind me of your grandfather," he said finally. "He built this business from the ground up, just like I did. Your brother doesn't have that in him, not yet. But you, he paused, his voice dropping lower. You've got the fire. I see it. Ice felt a swell of pride, but she didn't let it show. She only nodded, her gaze steady. But fire burns, Jade. You remember that, Jeremiah warned. I will, she promised, balancing two worlds. Unlike Caleb, Ice knew the importance of appearances. She wasn't just Jeremiah's daughter, she was also Jade Daniels, a first-year college student majoring in business management at Clark Atlanta University. Her mother, Imani, had insisted she get her degree. Education is your weapon, Jade, Imani would say. You can't fight the world with only your fists. Knowledge will protect you where money and guns fail. Ice didn't argue. In her world, knowledge was power. Every business strategy she learned in class felt like a new tool to sharpen the empire her father had built. She sat in the front row of her lectures, the only student who knew that her notes on supply chains and margins were being applied far beyond textbooks. After class, Ice often slipped back into her other life, her real life. One minute, she'd be arguing case studies with professors, and the next, she'd be reviewing street routes with Jeremiah's lieutenants. Her classmates saw her as the quiet, ambitious student who always had her head in her books. Nobody knew that her evenings were spent studying ledgers that held secrets far more dangerous than grades. A call from the streets. Later that day, Ice was downtown at one of their legitimate fronts, a boutique run by one of her father's trusted lieutenants. It was quiet, the hum of traffic outside blending with the jazz music playing softly over the speakers. Ice sat in the back office, reviewing ledgers and speaking with the manager, a woman named Carmen. This month looks solid, Carmen said, but there's been chatter. The Scorpios are moving again. Ice's eyes narrowed. The Scorpios were one of the newer crews in the city, small, but growing, and just reckless enough to be dangerous. Where are they moving? Ice asked. Carmen hesitated. South side, near our routes. Ice sat back, her jaw tightening. The South Side routes were the lifeblood of their operation, and the Scorpios knew it. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a challenge. Keep your ears open. Let me know if they make any more moves, Ice instructed, standing. I'll handle it. Carmen looked at her with a mix of admiration and unease. Be careful, Ice. They don't play fair, Ice smirked, the edge of her father showing through. Neither do I. Inheritance. As night fell, Ice found herself parked on the south side, watching the street from her tinted car window. She wasn't impulsive like Caleb, she wouldn't strike until she knew exactly what she was dealing with. But sitting in the dark, she felt the weight of her family's name pressing down on her shoulders. The Daniels legacy was carved into the streets of Atlanta, but it was up to her to decide what it would look like moving forward. Ice knew she couldn't rely on Caleb or anyone else. The empire needed a leader, someone willing to fight, to bleed if necessary. And Ice was ready. Her phone rung. A message from Carmen. They made a move. Meet me tomorrow. Ice slid the phone into her pocket and looked out at the city sprawled before her. Episode 3. Lines drawn in blood. Jade Ice Daniels knew that tomorrow wasn't promised, especially in the game her family played. The Scorpios were pushing too close to the Daniels territory, and that meant only one thing: they were testing boundaries. Carmen's message wasn't just a heads up, it was a signal. The streets didn't respect hesitation, and if Ice wanted to maintain control, she had to act decisively. Southside Recon. The next morning, Ice met Carmen at a diner on the south side. The air was thick with tension. Carmen's usually calm demeanor was replaced with unease as she slid into the booth across from Ice. They're setting up shop near the old warehouse on Fulton Street, Carmen said quietly, keeping her voice low. Their men are already moving in. If they're not stopped, they'll choke off our route by the end of the week. Ice's jaw tightened. Fulton Street wasn't just any route. It was critical to their operation, a hub for goods that kept the Daniels empire afloat. Losing it wasn't an option. How many men? Ice asked, her voice steady, though her mind was already racing. Carmen leaned forward, her dark eyes scanning the room. Enough to make a statement, but they're disorganized, cocky. They think nobody's going to push back. Ice's lips curled into a cold smile. Then they've underestimated us. Carmen hesitated. Caleb's going to want to lead this. Ice shook her head. Caleb's not ready. He'll run in guns blazing and leave us with twice the problems. We need precision. Quiet, calculated. Let me handle this. Carmen didn't argue. She'd seen Ice in action before. The younger Daniel sibling was nothing if not meticulous. Campus fronts. That afternoon, Ice returned to Clark Atlanta University, her double life a constant balancing act. She sat in a lecture on strategic business management, her notebook filled with insights that she'd apply as much to the streets as to the classroom. The professor's words about assessing risks and managing resources echoed in her mind, blending seamlessly with her plans for the Scorpios. During a break, Ice's phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. We need to talk. Now, Ice sighed. She knew this was coming. Caleb had heard about the Scorpios' moves, and he wasn't the type to stay sidelined. She texted back, meet me at the warehouse at 6. Family fractures. At p.m., Ice arrived at the warehouse where the Scorpios were making their move. Caleb was already there, pacing near his car, his expression a mix of frustration and determination. You think you can cut me out of this? Caleb demanded as soon as she stepped out of her car. Ice crossed her arms, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his agitation. I'm not cutting you out. I'm keeping us alive. There is a difference. Caleb stepped closer, his voice rising. This is my fight, Ice. Dad's the one who put me in charge. Dad put you in charge because he didn't have a choice. Ice shot back, her tone icy. But being in charge doesn't mean rushing into every fight without a plan. You want to lead? Then act like it. Caleb's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. The truth of her words hung heavy between them. Here's the plan, Ice continued, stepping past him and toward the warehouse. We're going to hit them tonight, quick and clean. No casualties on our side, no noise. We remind them who owns this territory, and we do it without turning the South Side into a war zone. Caleb followed her, his expression unreadable. For all his flaws, he respected Ice's mind. He'd seen her out-hink rivals before, and deep down, he knew she was right. Retaliation. Night fell, and Ice led a small team of trusted enforcers to the Fulton Street warehouse. The Scorpios had posted lookouts, but their overconfidence showed in their lax security. Ice moved like a shadow, her team following her lead as they infiltrated the perimeter. Inside, the Scorpios were gathered around a makeshift table, their conversation loud and careless. Ice observed them from the shadows, counting heads and noting weaknesses. Then, with a signal, her team moved in. The operation was swift and precise. Ice's team disabled the lookouts and cornered the Scorpios before they could react. Ice stepped forward, her presence commanding as she addressed their leader, a small-framed man with a scar across his cheek. You made a mistake coming here, she said, her voice calm but deadly. This is Daniel's territory. You want to stay breathing? You stay out. The man sneered, but Ice's enforcers tightened their grip on him and his crew, making it clear there was no room for negotiation. After a tense moment, the man nodded. Good choice, Ice said, stepping back. Now leave, and if I see you here again, it won't be a conversation. The Scorpios didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the warehouse, leaving their supplies behind. Ice's team quickly secured the area, ensuring the route was back under Daniel's control. Building her legacy. As Ice drove away from the warehouse that night, she felt the weight of her decisions settle over her. She had protected her family's empire, but she knew this was only the beginning. The Scorpios would regroup, and other crews would watch, waiting for signs of weakness. Back at the Daniels estate, Jeremiah waited for her in his study. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. It's handled, Ice said simply, dropping a ledger onto his desk. Jeremiah opened it, scanning the details of her operation. After a long moment, he looked up at her, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Your grandfather would be proud, he said. Ice didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. As she left the study, she knew that her path wouldn't be easy, but it was clear. She wasn't just a Daniels. She was the Daniels. And the streets were starting to understand that. To be continued. Episode 4. The Crown's Weight. Jade Ice Daniels had earned her place. The South Side was secure, the Scorpios had been dealt with, and the Daniels family's name still carried the weight it always had, maybe more. But Ice knew that holding the crown was harder than claiming it. The streets were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. And she couldn't give them one. Lines in the sand. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the first ripple hit. Ice was at the Daniels estate, sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing routes and ledgers. Her mother, Imani, moved through the room, humming softly as she brewed tea, her calm presence always a stark contrast to the weight Ice carried. The quiet was broken by the sharp tone of Ice's phone vibrating on the table. Caleb's name flashed on the screen. Ice hesitated, then answered. "What is it?" she asked, already sensing trouble. "They hit one of the South Side spots last night," Caleb said, his voice tight. "It was the Scorpios again. They're back, Ice. And they came heavy this time." Ice's fingers tightened around the phone. "Damage, 3 men down. One of ours is in the hospital. They torched the stash." It was a message. Imani turned to look at Ice, her concern evident, but she didn't interrupt. Ice stood, grabbing her leather jacket off the back of the chair. Her calm demeanor never cracked, though the fire inside her burned brighter than ever. "Meet me at the club," she said, ending the call. The showdown. The Daniels Club, their unofficial headquarters, was buzzing with tension when Ice arrived. Caleb was there, pacing, his frustration plain. Several lieutenants were gathered around a table, murmuring about what had happened. When Ice walked in, the room went quiet. "What happened last night doesn't happen again," Ice said, her voice cutting through the silence. "They're testing us. They think we're weak. We hit them back now, hard," Caleb said, slamming his fist on the table. "We've got the firepower to take out every last one of them." Ice shook her head. "No, that's what they want, chaos. If we move sloppy, we lose. I'm not burning down half the South Side to make a point, so what's the plan then?" Caleb challenged, his frustration boiling over. Ice stepped forward, planting her hands on the table. "We cut off their supply line. I already know where their shipments come in. Without product, they're nothing. We hit them where it hurts, and we do it clean. This isn't about making noise. This is about making sure they understand cross the Daniels, and you don't get back up." The room fell silent again. The lieutenants nodded, Caleb biting back his protest. For all his fire, he knew Ice's plans worked. The move. That night, Ice led the operation herself. The Scorpios' supply chain ran through a dockyard on the edge of town, a spot Ice had been watching for weeks. It was a risk, but the kind of risk that came with the crown. She moved with her team like a shadow, every step calculated. The Scorpios were there, unloading crates under dim floodlights. Ice watched from a distance, counting heads, noting weapons, tracking their routine. Her crew was small, but they had the advantage of precision and surprise. At her signal, they moved in. The first shots were silencers, taking out lookouts before they could raise the alarm. Ice moved with lethal efficiency, her team sweeping through the dockyard, dismantling the operation piece by piece. The Scorpios didn't know what hit them. At the center of the chaos, Ice found the Scorpio leader, the weary man with the scar, the same one she'd let walk away once before. This time, there was no negotiation. "I warned you," Ice said, her voice ice cold as she stepped over the fallen crates. "You didn't listen." The man tried to speak, but Ice didn't let him. She turned to her second in command. "Make sure the message is clear," she said, before walking away. "The crown is earned." When Ice returned to the Daniels estate that night, the house was quiet. The weight of the evening lingered on her shoulders, but it was a weight she'd learned to carry. In her father's study, Jeremiah sat in his chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked up as Ice entered. "I heard," he said simply. Ice stood in front of him, her expression unreadable. It's done. The Scorpios won't be a problem again. Jeremiah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You did good, Jade. For the first time, Ice heard it, not the tone of a father doubting his daughter, but the tone of a king acknowledging his heir. Jeremiah raised his glass slightly in a silent salute. Your grandfather used to say that the crown isn't given. It's earned, Jeremiah said. Tonight you earned it. Ice met his gaze, her expression steady, but inside, she felt it, the shift. She wasn't just Jeremiah's daughter anymore. She wasn't just the girl who balanced college classes and family business. She was the Daniels. The streets would learn that soon enough. A week later, Ice sat in the front row of her business management lecture, her notebook open, her mind sharp. On the surface, she was just another student, but the calm in her eyes masked a storm. The professor's lecture on strategic alliances and hostile takeovers made her smirk. Business is business, she thought. Whether it's boardrooms or the streets, her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. A message from Carmen. The south side is quiet. All clear. Ice closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. The streets belonged to her now, but she knew better than anyone power is never permanent, and she would be ready for whatever came next. The end. Thanks for watching.